We're going to turn and read from Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, and we're going to read from verses 14 to 19. Genesis chapter 3 and verses 14 to 19. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the background to this part of God's Word. This is just after God has created the whole universe, and He has created man to be His representative on earth. Man is the image of God on the earth. And God has given one command to man. He is not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if he does, he will die. What does man do? Many of you know. Adam ate of that tree. He ate of the fruit of that tree. He broke God's law. He rebelled against God. But God comes for man. He comes for him in judgment. But as well as that, He comes for him in redemption. The two are joined together. So let's break in now at verse 14 and hear what God says to man who has sinned. God first of all speaks to the serpent. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." To the woman He said, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." And to Adam He said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Amen. May the Lord bless to us His word. Now, it's great to see so many of you here this weekend. It really is so encouraging for the leaders and for me to see so many young people gathered here. And I'm sure you have been looking forward to all the fun and all the fellowship that is standard fare that you would expect from a weekend hosted by the Southern Presbytery CY Committee. What a group of people. But when you saw the topics for the talks, what did you think? Did you think, interesting? Or maybe you thought, ooh, that's heavy. Or did you think, I'd rather they didn't deal with that subject? Why is it good for us to consider the topic of heaven and hell? It's good for us to consider this topic. Indeed, it is necessary for us to consider this topic because each one of us will be in one of these two places. Each one of us, you, me, everyone who has ever lived, everyone who is living, or everyone who ever will live, will be either in heaven or hell for all eternity. I want to ask you a serious question. How many people on the planet die every second? If you have a watch and it has a second hand on it, how many people enter eternity every time that hand moves? I googled it yesterday. 2 people, 1.8, almost 2 people die every second on the face of the earth. There is a second coming when you will be one of those 2 people. Now is the time to give consideration to this question. My design in these first 2 talks, I'm going to give 2 talks on hell and then 2 talks on heaven. My design in these first 2 talks, it's not to frighten you. I want to speak primarily to your mind, and through your mind, I want to speak to your heart. I'm not here to scare you, but I am here to inform and warn you. In this talk now, I'm not going to so much get into the descriptions of hell that we hear in many evangelical circles. And that's not because what is said there is untrue. Most, if not all, of what is said is true. But what is spoken of usually is surface details. Much is made of certain aspects of hell, such as the fire, the worm, the darkness, and so on. I will touch on these as we come to them, but I want us to dig a little deeper to find what unites all these details together. So we're going to begin this evening by asking the question, what is hell? What is hell? And the short answer that I'm going to give you now and elaborate on as we go through is that hell is the absence of common grace. Hell is the absence of common grace. Now let's explore this together. So first of all, what is common grace? What is common grace? Common grace is every good gift of God that this undeserving fallen world enjoys, except for the gift of salvation. You see, salvation falls into a different category of grace. Salvation is what we call special grace. And we'll hopefully learn a bit more about that tomorrow evening and on the Lord's Day morning. But common grace is every good gift of God that falls outside of the bracket of salvation. When Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, he forfeited every good thing that God had given him. God had every right at that moment to sweep away every good thing that Adam and Eve enjoyed in the garden. And if God had done so at that moment, their existence would have become hellish. But God didn't do that. In announcing punishment on Adam and Eve, God didn't consign them to hell immediately. God held back his wrath for a time. But in this period of time, God gave undeserved good gifts to the entire human race. And these good gifts we call common grace. We read together Genesis 3:14 to 19. There are 3 things that stand out about what God said. 3 aspects, if you like, of common grace that God promised to Adam and Eve. In verse 19, God said to Adam, "You shall eat bread. You shall eat bread." We can call this God's universal common grace because by saying to Adam, "You shall eat bread," God was promising Adam that the entire universe would continue to exist in such a way that it would support human life. God would so control the universe that it would remain as a working operation. Just think of the planets and the stars. God keeps them in their orbit. He keeps them in their trajectory in such a way that they don't crash into each other and obliterate the universe into smithereens. But not only that, the entire universe is so finely tuned, and it is kept that way, so as to support life on this speck of clay that we call earth. God has cursed the earth because of man's sin. That is radical punishment. But it's not total punishment. God maintains all things in the universe so that this planet remains habitable and beautiful. That's universal common grace. God punished Adam and Eve personally as human beings, but they would still be reproductive and they would still be nurturing to one another. Verse 16 in Genesis 3 says, God said to Eve, "You shall bring forth children." This kind of common grace we can call general common grace, because it is common grace that is general to all mankind. By and large, the human race is still increasing. By and large, the human race is still multiplying. God maintains the human race in such a way that humans can live alongside other humans. What is the greatest threat to the human race? Well, not just today, but all through history. What is the greatest threat to the human race? It is the human race. Man's inhumanity to man. Human abuse of other humans. Humans trying to wipe out other humans. Mankind, the human race, is its own worst enemy. But the interesting thing is, sin did not obliterate the image of God in man with which he was created. Man still knows right from wrong. Now, yes, man will suppress the truth of God in unrighteousness. But humans cannot do that completely. Not yet, anyway. Humans still possess a sense of justice. The world still operates in a theatre of trust in other people's sense of justice. If you're at work, ask yourself the question, would you go to work for someone whom you didn't trust? If you didn't trust them, why are you going to work for them? You trust them to give you a fair wage. Why would someone employ you if they didn't trust that you would do the job? If you're at school, why would you sit an exam if you didn't trust the examiner to give you a fair mark? You see, we all operate in an arena, in a world where justice prevails generally. And then we can think about love. We live in a world where love is expected to thrive. Now, whatever notions the world has about love, and however they may twist the idea of love, yet love is plain to be seen in society generally. Now, there are sad cases where babies are left out to the elements to die. But by and large, this is a rare exception. This is not the rule. The rate of marriage breakdown is increasing, sadly. But people are still getting married, and many are remaining married and loving each other right throughout life. Friendships are hard to cultivate in society today, but many are still making solid, lifelong friendships. Love is the expectation for humanity generally. It is not the exception. People generally, to a greater or lesser degree, are loving and lovable. That is God's common grace, his general common grace. God punished Adam and Eve with strife in this life, pain, and eventual death. That was radical punishment. But it wasn't total punishment. That's general common grace. But there's one more area of common grace that I want us to consider for a moment. And it goes back to Genesis 3 and verse 15. And there we read of God's promise of one who would come to crush the head of the serpent. This would be a redeemer. That promise, it was given to the whole human race. Yes, it was only Adam and Eve, but it was given to the whole human race. And it was to be propagated. It was to be spread. As the human race would increase, that promise was to be spread amongst all humans, that God was going to provide a redeemer. Now, some would side with the serpent and fight against the seed of the woman, fight against the redeemer. But this was a gospel promise. Now, that's getting into the area of special grace, but for our purposes this evening, there is in that gospel promise gracious knock-on effects which we can call gospel common grace. These are gracious knock-on effects that would have implications for all mankind. You see, you could ask the question, why does the earth continue? The earth continues in existence because it is the arena of God's salvation. God has accomplished salvation in history, and he has been applying that salvation in history. And for that reason, the world is given the undeserved and gracious gift of time as God brings in his elect. The full and the final judgment of the wicked is being held back because God is bringing his people into his kingdom in his day of grace. God's common grace, and especially God's gospel common grace, is the reason that the punishment of hell has not already begun for unbelievers in this world. The day of God's grace is holding back the day of God's wrath. And there's another knock-on effect from this promise of a Redeemer. That other knock-on effect is the gift of opportunity. Everyone who has lived from Adam till now, and everyone who will live from now until the end, they have all lived, or they will all live, in a day of grace. They have lived in the age where the gospel promise has been held out to sinners. Now, I grant the fact that not every human being has heard the gospel. But the fact is, no one has the right to it. Not one person has the right to hear the gospel. No one can demand that God offer them the gospel. But the amazing thing is, the gospel has been in the world from the fall of man. And many have lived with the undeserved gift of opportunity. They have received the offer of the gospel. It has been held out in front of them. This very act of holding the gospel out in front of unbelievers is an undeserved favour of God. Now, what has all this talk of common grace to do with hell? Well, as I said at the start, hell is the absence of all this common grace. After Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, God had every right to pour out his wrath upon him then and there. But God didn't. God placed Adam in an environment of common grace, but only temporarily. One day, all of this common grace will be taken away from those who do not side with the promised Redeemer, and the absence of that common grace is hell. So let's go on now to consider what the absence of each of these areas of common grace will look like in hell. This is the second point. Absence of universal common grace. Absence of universal common grace. Universal common grace, as I said, is God's control of all things in the universe so that this planet remains habitable and beautiful. But hell, on the other hand, is the absence of that universal common grace. On earth, because of God's universal common grace, human beings' physical environment is one which they can enjoy. But in hell, man's environment is one which he must endure. This is what hell itself is like. And if you wanted a faint example of what this absence of God's universal common grace would be like, well, you can think of the 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt. Each plague was a removal of one aspect of universal common grace. The plague of blood removed the Nile region's ability to irrigate the crops that were grown around it. The plague of darkness removed the light of the sun from the Egyptians. Think of the knock-on effects of this to their life. Shortage of food and malnutrition. Famine would have resulted from this. Life would have become close to unbearable. And then the last plague was the removal of life itself. Each plague removed some aspect of God's universal common grace upon the Egyptians. Each of these plagues removed some good gift of God from the environment of the Egyptians that made life enjoyable and comfortable. Now think of how Jesus describes hell. Jesus speaks of it as the place where their worm does not die and where the fire is not quenched. John, in Revelation, describes those who receive the sentence of death, that they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Hell is described as a place of outer darkness. There is no natural beauty to behold in hell. There is nothing that will bring pleasure to the senses in hell. There will be no amazing sights, no amazing sounds, no amazing smells, tastes, or touch. Hell is a place of physical torment. The environment of hell is not designed to bring any measure of physical pleasure or comfort to those who are there. Everything about the environment of hell is designed to inflict pain and torment. There will be absolutely no relief in hell from the pain inflicted upon every sense of the body. Listen to what is said about those in hell from Revelation 14:11. The smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day and night. Can you imagine that? No rest. Constant agitation in pain and misery. Now, sometimes the objection is raised that the words in Scripture that describe hell in physical language are not literal. Some people tell us that the fire is not real. The worms, well, they're not real worms. The smoke and the sulfur, that's not real smoke and sulfur. It's all just a way of describing the destruction of the wicked in picture language. Well, there are two things to say to that. Number one, the people to whom Jesus spoke believed that hell was a literal place. The people to whom Jesus spoke believed that hell was literal, a literal place. The people in his day believed that hell was a place of physical torment, a place where there would be fire and worms and smoke and sulfur. They believed this simply because the Old Testament taught it. Now, if they believed that, and if Jesus used the same language to describe hell without qualifying it as figurative language, then there's only one conclusion that we can come to, and that's that Jesus believed in a literal hell. Jesus believed he was speaking literally. Jesus believed in a literal hell which has literal physical torments. Jesus was not using physical images to describe spiritual realities. He was using physical images to describe physical realities. But this leads us on to the second thing. In one sense, we could say that Jesus was speaking symbolically. Because when Jesus spoke of the torments of hell, he was using natural images to describe supernatural realities. The physical torments of hell, of which Christ spoke, are supernatural physical torments. Yes, Jesus used physical images to portray physical realities, but he used natural physical images to portray supernatural physical realities. When Jesus spoke of fire, he didn't speak of earthly fire, which goes out. He spoke of eternal fire, fire that cannot be quenched. When he spoke of a worm, he spoke of a worm which will not die. When John sees smoke and sulfur in Revelation, it is everlasting and eternal smoke and sulfur. What is being described in the Bible concerning hell is unlike anything that can be experienced on earth. The pain inflicted on earth, anything that inflicts pain on earth is only temporary. It must end. But that which inflicts pain in hell is eternal. And therefore it is supernatural, even though it is physical. I don't want anyone to take comfort from the fact that when Jesus said fire, he didn't mean earthly fire. Jesus meant something that is infinitely more horrendous than any earthly flame. those who are enduring the fire in hell at this moment in time are wishing that it was merely an earthly flame. So the absence of God's universal common grace produces an environment of physical, eternal torment. Then thirdly, we see the absence of general common grace. That is the third point. The absence of general common grace. A few moments ago, I said that general common grace is God's maintenance of the human race in such a way that humans can live alongside other human beings. Because of God's general common grace within fallen people, they are capable of doing good, at least outward good. Now, what would happen if that common grace was removed? Well, that's what happens in hell. All of that capability of doing good is removed. And the person in hell becomes an absolute and utter wretch. This is what those who go to hell will be like. Those in hell will not only find their environment unbearable, they will find themselves unbearable. They will find their company to be unbearable. God's common grace restrains sin, even in the hearts of unsaved people. Everyone is a sinner, but no one is as bad as they could be. No one has as yet committed all the sins that they want to commit. No one has as yet committed all the sins that they have the potential to commit. You see, God has placed some restraints on sin in this life. Parents, civil authority, rewards that encourage good behaviour, not to mention conscience, that fear of God that every human being has been created with. These things keep sin in check. Sin in this world cannot rise to full expression, even in the hearts of those who are unsaved. But in hell, all of those restrictions are removed. There is no family in hell. There is no civil society. There is no civic life in hell. There will be no love for others. There will be no respect for authority. There will be no common grace that will put a restraint on sin. Every sin imaginable will rise in the hearts of those in hell. Their minds will indulge in every form of lawlessness. One writer has said, "The will of the sinner is such that it would always wish to sin if it could." The heart of every person in hell will desire only one thing, and that is to be able to sin. Think about what God said of those who lived in Noah's day before the flood. Genesis 6 verse 5. "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." If that's what man was like on earth, where God's common grace operates, restraining the wickedness of the heart of man, then what must the heart of man be like in hell, where this common grace has been removed? On earth, there is much in God's general common grace that keeps people from committing all manner of wickedness. There are sins in this life that many unbelievers aren't tempted by, for one reason or another. But in hell, the heart of everyone is given over to be utterly controlled by their fallen, depraved nature. And yet, in a rather different sense, there will be a restraint on the expression of sin. Sin will freely rise in the hearts of the lost in hell, but they will be unable to act upon their sinful desires. But this restraint is not because of God's common grace. This restraint is because of the absence of God's common grace. Because just think of how many sins are committed that are actually an abuse of God's good gifts, an abuse of God's common grace. Let's just think of a few examples. In hell, there is no Sabbath breaking. That is because hell is in eternity, not in time. There will no longer be any first day of the week. There will be no dishonouring of parents in hell, because each and every unbeliever in hell will be in absolute isolation, in the darkness of eternal damnation. They will have no family around them. They will have no companions. There will be no society in hell. And for that same reason, there will be no murder, no adultery, no theft, no lying, no coveting. And that's not because those in hell lack the desire for these sins, but they will lack the opportunity to commit these sins. So you see, in hell, those who are there will be utterly consumed with the desire to sin. They will desire with every fibre of their being to give expression to their sinful impulses that are raging through their souls, but they will be unable to give outward expression to that sin. Just imagine the utter frustration that will bring. To be consumed with a desire to sin, but to be totally unable to fulfill that desire, not because of God's common grace, but because of the absolute absence of God's common grace. Those in hell will have an insatiable appetite for sin, but no way of satisfying that appetite. Except for one sin: blasphemy. Blasphemy against God. The only way those in hell will be able to express the frustration of their souls at wanting to sin, but being unable to do so, will be to blaspheme God. In your own time, read through Revelation and don't try to understand everything about it. If you do understand everything about it, tell me. I would like to know. But I want you to particularly notice, and especially in chapter 16, notice how the unsaved react to the judgments of God. They curse God. They blaspheme God. They do not repent, but their enmity towards God reaches fever pitch. This is the sin which those in hell are continually committing. Jesus described hell as a place where there would be weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. That phrase, gnashing of teeth, is very interesting. It means to grind your teeth in an absolute rage. Those who stoned Stephen, and that story is recorded in Acts chapter 8, they are said to gnash upon Stephen with their teeth. Now that doesn't mean that they come up to him and bit him. It means that they were so enraged by what he said that they were gritting their teeth in absolute fury. Jesus says multiple times, especially in Matthew, that those in hell will weep and gnash their teeth. Those in hell are enraged against God. Their hatred towards him, as much as their suffering, is the cause of this gnashing of their teeth. This is what unbelievers will be like when God removes his general common grace in hell. And then fourthly and finally, the absence of gospel common grace. The absence of gospel common grace. I described gospel common grace as the promise of a Redeemer. The promise of Jesus Christ. One of the most unnerving things about hell is that this covenant, this gospel common grace, is removed. The people in hell have no promise of a Redeemer. There is no prospect of any mercy to be held out to them. The gospel that they've heard on earth will never, ever be preached to them in hell. Some of them will know the gospel inside out. Some of them will have been reared with the gospel ringing in their ears. Some of them will have died with the gospel ringing in their ears. They will know it. But the mercy that is held out in that gospel in this life will never be held out to them again after life on earth is over. The gracious gift of opportunity will be gone. Those in hell no longer live in the sphere of God's saving operations. They no longer live where the gospel is saving people. They no longer live with believers. They no longer experience the effect of those whom Christ calls the salt of the earth, because those in hell are left alone in their utter depravity. The lost in hell have always been under the condemnation of God, even while they lived on earth. But they are now experiencing the wrath of God. Why is that? Because the gospel common grace, which delayed the wrath of God, has been removed. For those in hell, there is nothing for them now but suffering the just punishment of their sin and rebellion. The gracious gift of time will vanish as unbelievers close their eyes in death and go to hell. So if this is what hell is like, and if this is what those are like who go there, we can ask the question, why would God ever send people to hell? And this is what we will consider tomorrow morning. Now, I trust I have given you a realistic portrayal of hell. And at the beginning, I told you my design in this talk is not to frighten. It is to inform and to warn you. But if this talk has raised concerns in your heart and mind, please do come and talk to me or to Gareth or any of the other elders. I'll be going home to my bed, but I'll be about for a while. You can come and talk to me, talk to one of the leaders, talk to a trusted Christian friend. Because there is hope. This may have been a talk with no hope in it, but there is hope in the gospel, and I will bring that to you. I couldn't rest if I didn't bring you the hope of the gospel. But if you can't wait, come and talk to us. Nothing would give us more joy than to present Christ, present the hope of Him to you in the gospel.